Hi, I'm Andrew.
And I'm Dave, and we are the IB English guys. Today is video number 5, where we're going to talk about preparing to write a strong paper 2 response. We've already looked at a family supper in detail. We've looked at stones. We've talked about these two stories individually, and we've done our comparative thinking and our comparative chart. And now we're ready to write.
Yeah, remember, students and teachers, if you like this style of teaching and learning, this is part of our whole school resources. And students, you can also find this resource in the Paper 2 exam review. It's part of our For Students page. Now, Mr. Giles, today I think we want to talk about breaking down the question. Can you talk about why that's so important?
Yeah, absolutely. Before we can actually write a strong paper 2 response, we need to choose a question, and then we need to break down that question. By breaking down the question, we're going to look at what are the different components of that question. What are they asking us to do?
Yeah, if we don't understand all the command words and all the nuances of the words in the question itself, we're not going to write a good response. We have to make sure we take time, pause, and break that down. Why don't you start us off today, Mr. Giles?
Yeah, let's take a look at the question that we're being asked that we've chosen to focus on, and that is as follows. How do two of the works you have studied portray the struggle to be understood?
All right, hang on. How do two of the works you have studied portray the struggle to be understood? All right, Giles, let's talk about some of the key words that we want to think about if we were answering this question.
Okay, so the first word I see that is the word how. And oftentimes we're going to be asked how. When we think about how, what are we being asked to do?
We're thinking about authorial choices. We're thinking about the author's craft and how they make deliberate choices to shape meaning for the reader or for the audience, depending on what text type you're working with. Giles, we must include that because we know that's part of criterion B of our assessment rubric. I also see some other powerful words in there as well. I think the word struggle is really important. What might you say about the word struggle?
Well, a struggle, conveys this idea of difficulty, something that a character or the author, someone that they're trying to get through. And of course, the struggle in this case is the struggle to be understood. And that's an interesting idea, like to be understood by someone else, right?
Yeah, and I think about struggles. I'm immediately thinking about the word conflict, and I'm thinking about all the different types of conflict we can explore in our two respective texts. And again, thinking about, are those characters being understood? There's a lot to think about here with just breaking down the language of the question.
Yeah, that's right. Now we want to ask questions of the question. This is, again, what you need to do with your brain and think about, well, how can I tackle this question for my chosen works? So what are some questions that we could ask of this question, like the struggle to be understood?
Yeah, I think a really good question is who's doing the understanding? Is it the character themselves? Is it the reader? Is it the author trying to be understood through the character? I think there are a lot of different angles we can play when we look at this idea, this notion of being understood.
That's right.
What are some questions you might want to ask, Mr. Giles?
I might want to, once I've thought about who is trying to be understood and who is understanding, right?
Right.
We have two sides. I also want to think about, well, what actually is the message that they want to be understood? I need to understand that too.
Yeah, that's critical. You want to think about the key themes and motifs of the works themselves, because that's probably going to be the main backbone that goes through your whole response. You're not going to come up with some obscure interpretation. You want to go for the meat, Mr. Giles.
Yeah, that's good. And lastly, I might want to think about, well, is this struggle to be understood actually resolved in this story or in this text? Have they resolved that?
Yeah, that's actually really smart because we know we have different types of endings in our two works, so we do. We can think about beginnings and endings as broad authorial choices when we're examining works.
Okay, that's great. So that's kind of thinking about the question. So we're thinking about that struggle to be understood, and we're thinking about how authors are trying to convey that. So now that we've done all this heavy lifting in our previous videos, we need to go to that comparative chart and do some thinking about, well, how can we tackle this question?
Yeah, it'd be a shame to make that comparative chart and then not come back to it. We made that because we know we want to come back to it. So let's look at that comparative chart. Let's look at the themes and big ideas down the left-hand side, and let's see if we can find some interesting relationships that we can compare and contrast as we go through these two texts.
That's great. The first thing that we came up with when we made that chart is family conflict. We know that in both of these stories, at the heart of these stories are families. And they're thinking about the conflict that exists. And within that can be that struggle to be understood, family members trying to understand each other.
Sure, and we think about the cultural context of both works. We think about how flashback is used and how one character in Stones, for example, has experienced something other characters have not. We see many reasons for this lack of understanding within the two respective works.
Yeah, I love that. And I think that's interesting. It's generational, too. Like, I think the generations is something I want to wrap my head around. We also talked about silence. There's a lot of silence in both of these stories. And of course, when there's silence, people aren't talking. And that could convey the fact that there's unspoken tension.
Yeah, I think about the father from A Family Supper, and his silence really taps into that notion that he is not understood, but because of his conservative background in his traditional Japanese society, he doesn't really have the skills or the emotional wherewithal to be understood and communicate directly. That's a huge difference from the other texts. What's the lack of understanding, the lack of speaking in the other text comes from something else.
Yeah, it's mental illness, it's PTSD, and like the fact that he feels this deep shame and he can't really express himself. Again, those are really powerful.
You mentioned the word shame, and I see that's another big idea down the left-hand side of our chart. Can you talk about that, comparing and contrasting the two stories? Because ultimately, that's what we have to do.
Yeah, I think in A Family Supper, this idea of shame, this shame that Watanabe, the business partner, felt when they lost their company, but also a little bit of the shame that the father might feel because his kids have left the family. And I think the shame that the mother felt when her son left for the U.S., that's, again, that is at play in this story. And they're not expressing that shame in a positive way. And unfortunately, they choose self-harm as a way to express that.
Yeah.
That's damaging.
And I think about that lack of understanding in A Family Supper. Now, conversely, if we look at Stones, the lack of understanding, yes, it has to do with the family, but it's also between the father and his community at large as well. When he comes back from Dieppe, he doesn't feel like he fits well. He feels a great sense of shame, and that prevents him from successfully interacting within his community. So I think those are similar, but they're also a bit different as well.
Yeah, that's good.
Why don't we move forward and talk about the ending a little bit as well?
Yeah, that's right. The endings, again, we see this sort of ambiguity in A Family Supper and how things are kind of left hanging. Again, perhaps things haven't really been resolved like we talked about. And then in Stones, there's a much more definitive sense of closure and a less ambiguous ending. So we have other things that we talked about. We talked about the use of darkness. That could convey the sense of history.
We talked about different settings and how settings sort of tap into that idea on being understood based on where the authors chose to put their two works.
Yeah. And then lastly, we talked about lonely fathers. And we thought about the fact that these fathers are very isolated, and I think the stories are very much about fathers and sons. And in both stories, these fathers can't express their feelings. Now, I think this is, again, where we ended up focusing on this idea of the fathers as characters.
Now, remember, when we start actually getting into this rudimentary outline, which we're going to construct in a moment, we want to think about the how. How are the authors showing these connections? We want to think about the keyword struggle, and we want to maintain our focus on the word understood as we go down. Giles, now that we've sort of gone through and done this comparative thinking, we have some ideas where we'd like to go. What do you say we get to that thesis statement?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that. So again, we're thinking about a comparative thesis statement. We're focusing on the wording of the question, that idea of struggle to be understood. And in this case, we're focusing on the fathers. Hopefully all of our comparative discussion showed you how we eventually arrived at that idea. So here's the thesis statement we came up with. While the circumstances of their struggles are vastly different, the two fathers in A Family Supper and Stones both struggle to articulate their feelings and cope with their emotions. This struggle has dire consequences for the family dynamic, and in both cases results in fragmentation and discord.
Okay, Giles, first of all, some things I noticed. I love the fact that this writer has opted for 2 sentences in the thesis statement. That's perfectly fine. Don't try to smash a bunch of ideas together and sacrifice your grammatical accuracy. I love how the initial sentence starts with the word while, then we have a comma, then the second half of that clause. I think we've done well there putting in ideas. And would you say that this writer is going to focus on similarities or differences?
Definitely similarities. I mean, although their situations are different and the way that they struggle is different, clearly both fathers are unable to articulate their feelings.
Great. So, now that we've sort of taken you through our thesis statement for our text, again, you're thinking about, okay, you're doing the comparative work with your text, you're thinking about a thesis for your 2 texts. We'll show you our rudimentary outline, and then we'll encourage you to do the same. Giles, how might our writer organize this response? After the introduction, they're going to move into their first set of body paragraphs.
Yeah, we have to think about what are our comparative points. The first comparative point is just the characterization of the father, the way that father is characterized, again, through that first-person narrator. In both cases, it's a son talking about their fathers. And again, that's first we're going to talk about how the character of A Family Supper is characterized in relation to that struggle to be understood. And then we're going to look at the characterization of the father.
And then we're going to do that in Stones as well, looking at the characterization of the father in Stones and his struggle to be understood. Notice, folks, that characterization is a broad authorial choice. We're sort of pinning our idea into that broad authorial choice of characterization. Then we're going to use other supporting elements and textual references to talk about how the authors characterize the respective fathers.
Yeah, the next comparative point really is looking at symbolism. In fact, it's another broad authorial choice. And we're going to look at actually how the father in A Family Supper does kind of communicate his feelings, not through words, but through cooking and through kind of that indirectness that is, again, I think typical of sort of traditional Japanese culture.
Yeah,
right?
there's some really rich symbols there. And similarly, in Stones, we see some more rich symbols, how the father expresses his anger and emotion more in a violent way. I think I'd be focusing on the symbol of the hammer with respect to this emotional characterization. And then finally, Mr. Giles, when we're out of characterization, we're out of symbols, I think the last place I'd want to focus on would be the ending. That's a broad authorial choice as well. What might you say about the endings of these two respective works?
I think the final struggle, that ability to kind of overcome that struggle at the end of A Family Supper, the sort of ambiguity of that, and then his attempt to discuss Watanabe is again his way to kind of show that he loves his kids and he doesn't condone what Watanabe did. That's important. And then similarly, we see in Stones the father's final wishes to kind of be buried, to be a stone among stones. I think that's part of the closure.
Yeah, I think we've done well here, Mr. Jaws. We've looked at both these stories in detail. We have some broad authorial choices. That's the how the authors make choices to show that struggle to be understood. And we're thinking about how those choices shape meaning. Folks, now we'd like to encourage you to go through a similar process. We'd like you to take a paper 2 question. We have some sample questions in the video description below. We'd like you to go back. Well, first, we'd like you to choose a question and then go back to your comparative table and start playing with ideas. Craft a thesis and think about what are the broad authorial choices in your 2 texts that can help answer the question. Create that rudimentary outline, and then, Giles, we're going to see them back for our next video when we start finally with the writing process. In the end, we want you to remember that it takes a lot of planning and a lot of preparation. Don't just jump right in and start writing. Break down the question, reference all that great work we've done, and we believe you're on your way to paper 2 success. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on the channel.
Thanks, guys.